November 21st, 1985. A green Mustang tears through the streets of Washington, D.C. Inside, Jonathan Pollard grips the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Beside him, his wife Anne clutches a stack of documents. Behind them, unmarked FBI vehicles close in. They have one hope, one sanctuary: the Israeli embassy. The Mustang screeches into the embassy driveway. The gates open. For a moment, they're inside, safe, protected by diplomatic immunity. Jonathan Pollard, the man who spent 18 months stealing America's most sensitive secrets for Israel, believes he's reached his salvation. But then something happens that will define his entire story. After a tense standoff, the gates open again. Israeli security forces push them back out onto Massachusetts Avenue, straight into the waiting arms of the FBI. This is the story of a spy who loved a country that used him and betrayed the country that trusted him. A man who stole a room full of America's deepest secrets, only to discover he was disposable. His codename was gone, his handlers had fled, and the gates of the promised land had slammed shut in his face. But before we jump into this story, I would like to say thank you for the 7 subscribers. It really means a lot. If you don't mind commenting where you are watching from, I would love to know. Now back to the story. To understand how we got to that moment outside the embassy, we need to go back to the early 1980s. The Cold War was at its height. Ronald Reagan sat in the White House, warning of the evil empire. The Soviet Union was expanding its influence across the Middle East. And Israel, America's closest ally in the region, was fighting for its survival. In 1982, Israel launched a controversial invasion of Lebanon. The operation was meant to destroy the Palestine Liberation Organization, but it turned into a quagmire. Israel was hemorrhaging soldiers, facing international condemnation, and surrounded by enemies armed with Soviet weapons. The United States supported Israel militarily and financially, but the relationship was complicated. America shared intelligence with Israel, but not everything. Certain satellite imagery, certain signals intercepts, certain assessments of Arab military capabilities, these were kept in American vaults. Israel wanted more. They always wanted more. This is where Jonathan J. Pollard enters the story. Born in 1954 in Galveston, Texas, Pollard was brilliant but troubled. He graduated from Stanford University with a degree in political science. He was obsessed with Israel, obsessed with espionage, obsessed with being important. His colleagues would later describe him as a bullshitter, someone who exaggerated his credentials, made up stories about secret missions, claimed connections he didn't have. But despite his instability, despite the red flags in his background, Jonathan Pollard obtained a top-secret clearance and landed a job as an intelligence analyst at the Naval Intelligence Support Center in Suitland, Maryland. He had access to some of the most sensitive information in the American intelligence apparatus: satellite reconnaissance photos, signals, intelligence, assessments of Soviet naval capabilities, details about American sources and methods, and someone in Israel was watching. But here's what most people don't know. Jonathan Pollard was not recruited by the Mossad. He was recruited by a rival organization that the Mossad actually despised, the Scientific Relations Bureau, in Hebrew, LACOM. LACOM operated in the shadows of Israeli intelligence. While the Mossad conducted traditional espionage abroad, LACOM specialized in stealing scientific and technological secrets. They acquired nuclear materials, weapons systems, anything that could give Israel a strategic edge. They operated recklessly, often without coordination with other agencies. And in 1984, LACOM decided they needed a man inside American naval intelligence. They chose Jonathan Pollard. But who was Jonathan Pollard before he became a traitor? To understand the betrayal, you have to understand the man. And Jonathan Pollard was not your typical spy. He wasn't cool under pressure, he wasn't disciplined or methodical. He was desperate, desperate to matter, desperate to be special, desperate to be seen. From childhood, Pollard constructed elaborate fantasies about himself. He told classmates his father was a CIA operative. He claimed he'd lived in Israel and trained with military intelligence. None of it was true. His father was a respected microbiologist, but Jonathan needed him to be James Bond. At Stanford, he studied political science but spent most of his time in the library reading spy novels and intelligence journals. He tried to join the CIA after graduation. They rejected him. Drug use, they said. Questionable stability. He applied again, rejected again. So he settled for a position as a civilian intelligence analyst with the Navy. Not glamorous, not exciting. Just a desk job processing reports about Soviet naval movements. But Pollard couldn't accept being ordinary. He started telling colleagues he was working on classified projects he couldn't discuss. He claimed he'd been sent on secret missions to the Mediterranean. He showed up at parties and whispered about intelligence operations that never happened. His co-workers thought he was pathetic, a wannabe spy living in a fantasy world. And that's what made him dangerous. Because when Israeli intelligence came calling, Jonathan Pollard didn't see it as espionage. He saw it as his chance to finally be the hero he'd always pretended to be, the man in the shadows, the secret warrior, the spy who saved Israel. The psychological profile was clear. Narcissistic personality disorder, probably. A desperate need for validation. An inability to distinguish between his fantasies and reality. These weren't just character flaws. They were vulnerabilities. Weaknesses that a skilled intelligence officer could exploit. And Rafi Eitan, the legendary spy master who ran LACOM, was very skilled. Eitan had been in the Israeli intelligence game since the 1940s. He'd helped capture Adolf Eichmann. He'd run operations across Europe and the Middle East. He knew how to spot a potential asset. And more importantly, he knew how to manipulate one. Jonathan Pollard wasn't recruited because he was reliable. He was recruited because he was exploitable. And that distinction would matter. A lot. The recruitment happened in the summer of 1984 in Washington, D.C. Jonathan Pollard was introduced to a man named Aviam Sela, Colonel Aviam Sela, an Israeli Air Force hero, a fighter pilot who had flown daring missions in the Yom Kippur War, handsome, charismatic, decorated. To Jonathan Pollard, Aviam Sela was everything he wanted to be. They met at a hotel. Sela listened to Pollard talk about his job, his access, his frustration that America wasn't sharing enough intelligence with Israel. Sela asked careful questions, and then he made his pitch. Israel needed Pollard's help. The Jewish state was in danger. Arab armies were preparing for war, armed with Soviet weapons, chemical weapons in Syria, nuclear programs in Iraq. The PLO plotted attacks from Tunisia. And America was withholding the intelligence Israel needed to defend itself. Pollard later claimed he did it purely out of ideological commitment to Israel, a Zionist helping the Jewish homeland. But the facts complicate that narrative, because Jonathan Pollard was paid, well, $2,500 a month, cash, a diamond and sapphire ring for his wife Anne worth $10,000, promises of more, luxury travel to Europe and Israel, a Swiss bank account, discussions of a lifetime pension when he eventually moved to Israel. This wasn't just ideology, this was a business transaction. The methodology was almost laughably simple. Pollard would use his top secret clearance to request classified documents. He'd claim they were needed for his work. Then he'd physically walk out of the Naval Intelligence Support Center with a briefcase full of secrets. His handlers gave him shopping lists, specific requests. They wanted satellite imagery of PLO headquarters in Tunisia. They wanted technical manuals for Soviet weapons systems being sold to Syria. They wanted signals intelligence on Iraqi communications. They wanted American assessments of Saudi air defenses. They wanted details on how American spy satellites worked, so Israel could avoid their coverage. Pollard delivered it all. The handoffs happened at a prearranged location in Washington, an apartment rented by his Israeli handlers. Pollard would arrive with his briefcase. His handler, Yosef Yagor, would take the documents to another room where a high-speed copier was running. They'd photograph every page, then give the originals back to Pollard so he could return them the next day. Sometimes they didn't even give them back. Pollard would just request new copies, claiming he'd lost the file. For 18 months this continued, week after week, month after month. Jonathan Pollard stole an estimated 1 million pages of classified material. 1 million pages. If you stacked them up, the pile would be taller than a man. If you loaded them into a truck, you'd need a convoy. This wasn't a leak. This was a hemorrhage. The intelligence Pollard provided wasn't just paper. It had real-world consequences. October 1st, 1985. Israeli F-15 fighter jets took off from their bases and flew across the Mediterranean Sea. Their target? Tunis, Tunisia, 1,500 miles from Israeli territory. The target was the headquarters of the Palestine Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat's compound. Operation Wooden Leg. The Israeli jets struck with devastating precision. They knew exactly where to bomb. The command centers, the communications facilities, the ammunition depots. 75 people were killed, including PLO officials and Tunisian civilians. The attack stunned the world. How did Israel execute such a complex long-range strike with such accuracy? The answer, many believe, was sitting in Jonathan Pollard's briefcase. American satellite imagery showing the exact layout of the PLO compound, intelligence on Tunisian air defenses, flight routes that would avoid radar coverage, all of it stolen from U.S. intelligence files and handed to Israel. The Reagan administration was furious. They hadn't authorized the use of American intelligence for this attack. The United Nations Security Council condemned Israel. And deep inside the American intelligence community, people started asking questions. How did Israel know so much? Back at the Naval Intelligence Support Center, Pollard's colleagues were getting suspicious. Co-workers noticed him requesting documents that had nothing to do with his job, files on Soviet arms shipments, satellite photos of the Middle East, communications intercepts from Arab capitals. He'd take home enormous stacks of paper, claim he needed them for weekend work. One analyst watched him stuff classified documents into a duffel bag and walk out of the building. In October 1985, Naval Criminal Investigative Service opened a case. On November 18th, investigators confronted Pollard in his office. They asked about the documents. Why was he accessing files outside his area of responsibility? Why was he removing classified material from the building? Pollard tried to talk his way out. He claimed he was doing research for his supervisor. He was working on a special project. Everything was authorized, but his answers didn't add up. The investigators told him they'd be watching. They'd be checking his access logs. They'd be auditing what he took out of the building. Jonathan Pollard knew it was over. He used a prearranged code word, cactus. He called his handler and said the word. It meant, "I've been blown. The operation is compromised. Get out." And they did. Aviam Sella, the Air Force hero who recruited him, immediately boarded a plane back to Israel. Yosef Yagur, his handler, fled to Israel. Rafi Eitan, the legendary spy master who ran the entire Laycam operation, disappeared. Within days, every Israeli intelligence officer connected to Jonathan Pollard was safely back in Israel. Everyone except Jonathan Pollard. The public knows Jonathan Pollard stole classified documents. 1 million pages sounds like a lot, but what was actually on those pages? What made them so dangerous? The truth is worse than most people realize. Pollard didn't just steal satellite photos. He stole the radio signal notations manual, a 10-volume document that detailed every radio frequency used by every component of the U.S. military worldwide. With this manual, any hostile nation could intercept and decode American military communications. He stole the vulnerability and threat assessment manual for the entire Middle East. This document outlined every weakness in Arab air defenses, every gap in radar coverage, every vulnerability in communications networks. In the wrong hands, it could enable devastating attacks or allow enemies to shore up their defenses against American forces. He stole details about the KH-11 spy satellite system, including its orbital patterns, photographic capabilities, and methods of transmitting data. Knowing when American satellites could see you and when they couldn't was worth billions in military advantage. He stole information about U.S. intelligence collection methods in the Soviet Union, sources, techniques, how America was spying on Moscow. And most troubling of all, he stole what's called talent keyhole imagery, satellite photographs so sensitive that their very existence was classified. These weren't just pictures. They were evidence of what America could see from space, which installations we were watching, which leaders we were tracking, which programs we had penetrated. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger would later write that some of what Pollard stole could not be obtained by the Soviets through their own collection systems. In other words, Pollard gave away secrets the Soviet Union couldn't steal on their own. And here's where it gets truly dark. In the late 1980s, the CIA began losing sources inside the Soviet Union. Assets were being arrested, operations were failing. For years, the CIA blamed Aldrich Ames, the CIA officer who was spying for Moscow. But some intelligence officials believed there was another source of the compromise. The theory: Israel, desperate to secure immigration rights for Soviet Jews, had traded some of Pollard's stolen intelligence to Moscow as a bargaining chip. A few American secrets in exchange for letting thousands of Jews leave the USSR. Israel has always denied this, furiously, unequivocally. No credible evidence has ever been made public. But the suspicion never went away. And it meant that Jonathan Pollard wasn't just a spy who helped an ally. He was potentially responsible for the deaths of American intelligence assets behind the Iron Curtain. That's what was in the briefcase. That's what he sold for $2,500 a month and a sapphire ring. November the 21st, 1985. The green Mustang. The desperate race to the embassy. The gates opening, then closing. Jonathan and Ann Pollard were arrested on the spot. The FBI searched their apartment. They found classified documents stuffed in closets, hidden under beds, piled in the garage, evidence of payments from Israel, airline tickets to Tel Aviv, the diamond ring. Jonathan Pollard was advised to cooperate. His lawyers told him the government wanted him to plead guilty. If he did, if he helped them understand the full scope of the damage, they would recommend a moderate sentence. He agreed to a plea deal, but behind the scenes, something else was happening. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger prepared a classified memorandum for the judge, a damage assessment. It detailed what Pollard had stolen and what it meant for American national security. The memo was devastating. Weinberger wrote that Pollard's espionage had caused more damage to U.S. national security than almost any spy in American history. He said Pollard had compromised intelligence sources and methods. He said American agents were at risk. He said the stolen documents, if they fell into the wrong hands, could lead to the deaths of American personnel. And then Weinberger hinted at something even darker. There were reports, unconfirmed but deeply troubling, that some of Pollard's stolen intelligence had ended up in Soviet hands. That Israel, eager to secure the release of Soviet Jews, had traded American secrets to Moscow as a bargaining chip. Israel has always denied this, vehemently. No evidence has ever been publicly confirmed. But the rumor hung over the case like a shadow, and it influenced what happened next. March 4th, 1987. Jonathan Pollard stood before Judge Aubrey Robinson in a federal courtroom in Washington, D.C. He expected leniency. His lawyers had negotiated a plea deal. He had cooperated with investigators. The standard sentence for espionage on behalf of an allied nation was 10 to 15 years. Judge Robinson read Weinberger's classified memo. He looked at Jonathan Pollard, and then he sentenced him to life in prison. Life. Jonathan Pollard collapsed. His wife Ann screamed. His lawyers were stunned. The message was clear. You betrayed your country. You put American lives at risk. You sold our secrets for cash and jewelry. And the fact that you sold them to an ally made it worse, not better. Because allies are supposed to trust each other. For the next 28 years, Jonathan Pollard sat in federal prison. His case became a diplomatic wound that never healed. Every time an Israeli prime minister met with an American president, the subject came up. Free Pollard, pardon Pollard, release Pollard. Bill Clinton considered it. George W. Bush refused. Barack Obama eventually agreed to parole, but only after decades behind bars. The American intelligence community never forgave him. CIA directors, secretaries of defense, Pentagon officials, they all opposed his release. They argued he was a traitor who had sold out his country for money, endangered American lives, and showed no genuine remorse. In Israel, the narrative was different. To many Israelis, Jonathan Pollard was a hero, a Jew who helped the Jewish state in its time of need. A man punished unfairly because of anti-Semitism in the American establishment. A forgotten soldier abandoned by his own handlers. The Israeli government eventually granted him citizenship while he was still in prison. Politicians wore Free Pollard buttons. Rallies were held in Jerusalem demanding his release. But quietly, many in Israeli intelligence were less sympathetic. The Mossad had warned that running a spy inside America was reckless, that it would destroy trust between the two countries, that if caught, it would be catastrophic. Rafi Eitan, the spy master who recruited Pollard, admitted years later that the operation was a mistake, that they never should have run him, that the damage to U.S.-Israel relations wasn't worth it. And Aviam Sella, the Air Force hero who first approached Pollard, he was quietly retired from the military, never punished, never extradited, never held accountable. November 20th, 2015. After serving nearly 30 years, Jonathan Pollard was released on parole. But he wasn't free. Not really. He was required to wear an ankle monitor. He couldn't leave the United States. He had to report to a parole officer. He couldn't speak to the press without permission. Israel continued to lobby for his complete freedom. They wanted him home. Finally, on December 30th, 2020, after his parole restrictions expired, Jonathan Pollard boarded a plane. Destination, Tel Aviv. He landed at Ben Gurion Airport. He kissed the ground. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was there to greet him. "Welcome home," Netanyahu said. Pollard wept. After 35 years, the spy had finally reached the sanctuary he'd been racing toward in that green Mustang in 1985. The gates that had closed were finally open. But what happened during those 28 years behind bars? What did Jonathan Pollard think about? How did he change? Did he change at all? The letters from prison tell a complicated story. In the early years, Pollard was defiant. He wrote to supporters insisting he was a political prisoner. He argued that his sentence was unjust, motivated by anti-Semitism in the American intelligence community. He claimed he was a Jewish hero being punished for helping Israel survive. "I did what I had to do," he wrote in 1992, "and I would do it again." But as the years dragged on, something shifted. In a letter from 2003, Pollard wrote about the isolation. 23 hours a day in a cell, no windows, no contact with other prisoners. Years of solitary confinement that the United Nations would later classify as torture. "I'm disappearing," he wrote, "piece by piece, memory by memory. I can't remember what the sun feels like." His wife Anne divorced him in 1990. She'd served her own sentence, 5 years for being an accessory, and wanted nothing more to do with him. Pollard remarried in prison to a Canadian teacher named Esther. She became his lifeline, his only visitor besides lawyers. In the late 2000s, Pollard's health deteriorated. Diabetes, high blood pressure, the prison diet and lack of exercise were killing him slowly. He filed medical appeals. They were denied. By 2010, a different tone crept into his letters. "I think about the people I hurt," he wrote. "Not just the government, the people, the agents whose names I compromised, the analysts who had to rebuild systems I exposed, the allies who stopped trusting America because of what I did." Was this genuine remorse or manipulation? A calculated attempt to soften public opinion and secure his release? Even Pollard probably didn't know. In 2013, he wrote perhaps his most revealing letter. It was to a former colleague at the Naval Intelligence Support Center, someone who'd testified against him at trial. "You were right," Pollard wrote. "I told myself I was helping Israel. But really, I was just trying to feel important. I wanted to be special. I wanted to matter. And I destroyed everything to get it." The colleague never responded. When Pollard was finally released in 2015, reporters asked him if he had regrets. "I regret," he said carefully, "that my actions caused harm to the United States. But I don't regret trying to help Israel." Classic Pollard. Even after 3 decades in prison, he couldn't fully own what he'd done. He couldn't separate the fantasy of being a hero from the reality of being a traitor. A psychiatrist who evaluated him in prison noted, "Mr. Pollard has never fully integrated the two narratives of his life, the story he tells himself about being a righteous defender of Israel, and the objective truth that he was a compromised asset who sold secrets for money and ego gratification." 28 years in prison? And Jonathan Pollard still couldn't reconcile who he wanted to be with who he actually was. Maybe that's the real tragedy. But there's another side to this story, one that's often ignored in American retellings. In Israel, Jonathan Pollard is not seen as a traitor. He's seen as a forsaken agent, a Jew who helped the Jewish homeland and was abandoned by the state he served. Rabbi Mordecai Eliyahu, the former chief rabbi of Israel, called Pollard a holy man who sacrificed himself for the survival of the Jewish people. Posters in Jerusalem depicted him as a modern-day prophet. imprisoned for speaking truth to power. Why this disconnect? To understand, you have to understand the Israeli perspective on intelligence sharing with the United States. Throughout the 1980s, Israel faced existential threats. Iraq was developing nuclear weapons with French assistance. Syria was stockpiling chemical weapons with Soviet help. The PLO was planning attacks from bases in Tunisia and Lebanon, and Israel's Mossad believed, correctly it turned out, that Arab nations were preparing for another coordinated war. Israel asked the United States for intelligence, satellite imagery of Iraqi nuclear facilities, signals intercepts from Syrian military communications, details about PLO training camps. The United States said no, or rather, they shared some intelligence, but not all. American policymakers were worried about Israeli preemptive strikes destabilizing the region. They were worried about intelligence being used for operations the U.S. hadn't authorized. From the American perspective, this was prudent policy. You don't give your ally a loaded gun and let them decide when to pull the trigger. From the Israeli perspective, this was a betrayal. America was withholding intelligence that could save Israeli lives. They were prioritizing Arab relationships over the survival of the Jewish state. Enter Jonathan Pollard. The intelligence he provided filled the gaps. The satellite photos of the Iraqi Osirak reactor that Israel later bombed. The details about Syrian chemical weapons that Israel needed to prepare defensive measures. The PLO communications that led to the Tunisia strike. To many Israelis, this wasn't espionage. It was survival. Yair Lapid, a former Israeli foreign minister, argued, Pollard gave Israel information about threats to Israeli civilians. Information that America should have shared as an ally, but didn't. He's not a traitor to America. He's a hero to Israel. Even some Israeli intelligence veterans who opposed the operation acknowledged the results. One former Mossad officer, speaking anonymously, said, "Was running Pollard a mistake? Strategically, yes. It damaged our relationship with America for decades. But the intelligence he provided, it saved lives, Israeli lives, and we don't apologize for that." This is the moral paradox at the heart of the Pollard case. From one angle, he's a traitor who sold his country's secrets for money and ego. From another angle, he's a Zionist who filled intelligence gaps that could have led to Israeli deaths. Both can be true. And that's what makes this story so complicated. When Pollard finally arrived in Israel in 2020, thousands of people lined the streets to cheer him. Banners read, "Welcome home, hero," and "Thank you for your sacrifice." In America, intelligence veterans watched the coverage and felt sick. Two allies, two truths, and one spy caught in between. Jonathan Pollard's story is a tragedy without heroes. He was a troubled man who craved importance and found it in betrayal. A self-proclaimed Zionist who took money and jewels while claiming ideological purity. A spy who loved a country that used him and destroyed the country that trusted him. The Israeli intelligence operatives who recruited him walked free. The American government he betrayed gave him life in prison. And the secrets he stole, 1 million pages of classified material, disappeared into the archives, their full damage still unknown. Was the life sentence justice for a traitor? Or was it vengeance against an ally that crossed a line? Was Jonathan Pollard a hero who helped Israel survive? Or a mercenary who sold his country's secrets for cash and ego? The answer depends on where you're standing. In Washington, his name is still synonymous with betrayal, a reminder that even allies can't always be trusted, that secrets have a price, that loyalty to a foreign nation, no matter how noble the cause, is still treason. In Jerusalem, his name is synonymous with sacrifice, a Jew who put the survival of the Jewish state above his own freedom, a forgotten soldier who spent 3 decades in prison while his handlers lived free. The Israeli gates that closed in 1985 finally opened in 2020, but the questions remain. Jonathan Pollard is in his 70s now, living in Jerusalem with his wife Esther. He gives occasional interviews, always maintaining that he did the right thing, that Israel deserved the intelligence, that his sentence was unjust. He never quite says he's sorry. And maybe that's the final tragedy, that even after everything, the arrest, the life sentence, the decades in prison, the broken health, the shattered illusions, Jonathan Pollard still can't admit what he really was. Not a hero, not a martyr, just a troubled man who wanted to feel important and paid for it with his life. The briefcase is empty now. The secrets are long since compromised. The handlers are retired or dead. But the damage to trust, to alliances, to the lives of intelligence assets whose names were in those stolen files, that damage is permanent. 1 million pages, 35 years, 2 countries, and one question that will never be fully answered. Was it worth it? What do you think? Was Jonathan Pollard a hero or a traitor? Did the punishment fit the crime? Let us know in the comments. And if you stayed for the whole video, thank you so much, I appreciate you. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. I will see you in the next episode. Take care.